Good afternoon. My name is Christophe Besacier. I am the coordinator of the FAO Forest and Landscape Restoration Mechanism, and it is a pleasure for me to open this meeting today. I would like to begin by taking the chance to thank the Landscape Finance Lab for the great work they do for the organization of the event on finance, and I am really happy about our successful ongoing partnership funded by several FO projects for this series of webinars on finance for forest landscape restoration. It is thanks to this profitable cooperation that we are delighted to bring to you this third learning challenge, which will continue the learning series on financing forest and landscape restoration, with a focus on the private sector in landscape scale investment and building bankable business plans for restoration activities. As you are all aware, financial barriers represent one of the issues that most impact the implementation of forest landscape restoration. And indeed, the great investment are needed to upscale global restoration efforts to meet the ambitious goals set by the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration by 2030. The private sector can and should play a fundamental role in meeting these goals. The sensitive role of the private sector in becoming more and more important as mobilizing and leveraging private investment that complement public investment promises to be transformational for rural communities and economies in many developing countries. Investment required to achieve the sustainable development goals, the SDGs, and it cannot be met through official development assistance and government resources alone. The differentiation of this third learning challenge will explain how private investors can reduce pressures on ecosystems and contribute to their protection and restoration. Today, and in the upcoming session, you will learn how to identify key private sector actors within your landscape and their motivations to invest. Also, this week, you have an interactive workshop on how to complete stakeholder mapping and analyze potential connection and engagement opportunities with the private sector. In addition, a special focus of this learning challenge will revolve around preparing bankable business plan, so as to develop convincing investment proposal, and you will have the opportunity to discover, I think in early March, 3 learning courses developed by our team with the support of Finance Lab on developing bankable business plan for sustainable forest-based enterprise, which aims to improve the capacity of small producers, their organization, and small and medium-sized enterprise to access private investment and finance for sustainable forest-based businesses. After its launch, you will be able to take the course free of charge online on the FAO e-learning academy, and you will be granted with a digital badge certificate upon completion. Today, we welcome the following speakers. First, we have Florian Vernaz from landscape lead at Landscape Finance Lab. Florian holds over 15 years of experience in responsible investment and sustainable landscape planning. Before joining the lab, Florian worked with leading environmental organizations such as the Global Green Growth Institute to facilitate green investment at the landscape level. Florian notably facilitated the development of the Environmental and Social Action Plan for the first green landscape bonds in Southeast Asia. He is passionate about rural development in Eastern Indonesia and has assisted numerous social enterprises to build equitable markets linkages for local communities, Sulawesi, Maluku, and Papua. Then we will have Akshay Regmi, sorry for the pronunciation if it's not the perfect one, a climate catalyst. Akshay has pursued diverse roles in the international development, impact investment, and social entrepreneurship spaces. Prior to joining Climate Catalyst, he started a social enterprise based in Asia and managed Kiva's organization South and the Southeast Asia portfolio of investment to social impact organization. He holds a degree from Maastricht University in the Netherlands and the Johns Hopkins University in the US. And finally, the third speaker will be Andika Putraditama. Is the head of Rimba Collective at Lestari Capital. Andika leads the implementation and the strategy development of Lestari Capital's flagship funds, the Rimba Collective, with the aim of delivering $1 billion to forest conservation and restoration in Southeast Asia over a 25-year period. In his current capacity, he oversees the operational aspect, management, quality, and consistency of the delivery of the Rimba Collective unique financing mechanism. This includes working across multiple work streams, such as providing inputs for the legal, financial, and technical due diligence for projects in the pipeline, supervising and supporting the development of communication materials for Rimba Collective, and engaging directly with users of Rimba Collective. I wish you profitable discussions during the upcoming weeks, an happy learning event, and thank you again for joining us.
So the learning objective for today, looking at private sector engagement, would be first to develop a common definition of private sector actors and who we are speaking about, to understand more clearly what drives private sector towards landscape engagement and landscape approach, and how to leverage private sector engagement to accelerate and scale up transformation of food and other land-based systems at landscape level. All right. So on that first slide, we're looking at the landscape, understood as an area where man and nature interact. So there are a lot of different economic activities happening within the landscape. And a good starting point to look at private sector engagement into a landscape is to look first at the primary stakeholders. So by that, we mean land managers who produce raw material within a certain landscape. So this can be farms, this can be forestry concessions, plantations, mines, and so on. So all those actors that are directly managing land and feeding raw material towards the secondary and tertiary producers. So by that, we mean factories that will produce derived products from those raw materials, traders that do not have a direct role in managing the land, but that do actually have a very important influence because they are driving demand for certain commodities and directly influencing land use and production practices from those primary producers. There are also very important supply chain actors beyond the boundaries of the landscape, meaning companies that are not present physically in the landscape, but that have a very important role to play in the value chain. So, for example, consumer good companies like Nestle, Unilever, bankable, and so on, they have a very important role to play in shaping demand and standards for key commodities produced in the landscape, naming a few: cacao, palm oil, rubber, and so on. So they are very important because they can open access to new market opportunities to support landscape approaches. They can help, to integrate supply chains and smallholder farmers within a higher standard production system. And they can influence, they can leverage their influence as buyers and off-takers to influence land managers and producers to adopt higher standards and to integrate the supply chain. Yeah. So, for example, they have very high commitments for Scope 3 emissions, NDP, zero deforestation, and so on, that will be passed on towards primary and secondary producers within the landscape. So yeah, it's very important to look at that and to not limit our mapping towards the boundaries of the landscape. Financial institutions seem to be obvious when we talk about landscape finance. However, very often they are not involved in the early design stage, and that can actually be very useful to do that because they can contribute to shape the intervention and to influence also supply chain actors. It's important to start thinking about it early on because it's part of the strategy to see how you're going to mobilize finance and to develop financing mechanism to better, integrate the different stakeholders within a common platform and to quickly be able to scale up the intervention. So very often it's a huge asset to have a financial partner early on when you discuss about landscape opportunities. Okay, so in the next slide, we are looking at a summary of those different actors. So we've covered most of them already. One thing to insist on, however, is the importance of the informal sector. So not registered companies. It can be unregistered farmer, for example, smallholder farmers that do not have access to land titles, that do not have a formal relationship to a mill or a factory, but that have a very important role to play in driving the land use dynamic within a specific landscape. So the question here is how do we integrate those informal actors that have a very real impact on the landscape within a sustainable value chain? So what kind of incentives can we provide to make sure that they integrate into a supply chain that is consolidated, that is traceable, and that complies with higher production standards? Okay, so what drives private sector? It's very important to understand the incentive and pressure points of the private sector to move toward landscape approach. So obviously, the main purpose of private sector organization is to create shareholder value, and value can be financial and non-financial. There are a lot of organizations that have mainstream triple bottom line as a core concept of value creation. So it will look not only at financial returns, but also at social and environmental benefits. That being said, even if we look more narrowly at purely financial incentives, it's very important to highlight that the landscape approach can actually affect the bottom line of private sector. First, by affecting revenue. So by working towards sustainable landscape planning, you can impact revenues by, for example, having a price premium integrated into your strategy, meaning that consumer will be willing to pay a higher price because they perceive a positive contribution of the company to environmental and social outcomes. It will also potentially improve the quality of the product. For example, in the rubber industry, a lot of those landscape approach are aimed not only at improving the social and environmental condition in a specific landscape, but also to work with farmers to improve the quality of the rubber being produced and fed into factories. So that's a very important component as well. Then there is also the factor of brand differentiation and competitive advantage that a sustainable company will have over its competition, and also to have a secure supply. I mean, this is a very important business risk, especially with climate change and very unpredictable weather pattern, to make sure that they invest in adaptation and resilience, and that they can also have a loyal base of supplier to make sure that they have stability in their supply. On the other hand, the landscape approach can also contribute to reduce cost by reducing first the cost of finance, opening up new opportunities to access grants and other blended finance mechanism. So it will reduce the cost of financing the operations. The operation itself can be made more efficient, for example, by reducing the cost of input, like water, electricity, fertilizers, and so on. And also a very important aspect to take into consideration is the reduced cost of social conflict. which in certain areas like palm oil or mining can be a very important risk and cost to manage, and by extension to secure the social license to operate and to make sure that those risks are managed accordingly. Finally, I mean, there is a reduced cost of compliance. So this is also a very important cost driver, which is to look at how companies need to comply with not only existing regulations and mandatory requirements, but also with all the new voluntary commitments related to zero deforestation, scope 3 emissions, and so on. So by investing early on in the landscape approach, they can contribute to reduce the future cost of compliance by having stronger social and environmental safeguards in place. So this is important to understand, those incentives. And then why should we actually engage with the private sector? Why does it make sense for civil society organization to partner with private sector? First, because of the time and resources that they can contribute. And for example, having large off-takers and financially strong partners within a multi-stakeholder platform will increase its legitimacy and potentially increase also the leverage that this consultation process and multi-stakeholder platform can have over landscape actors, notably government and producers. Then they can bring also expertise and technical assistance, for example, to work with smallholder farmers to improve production processes, productivity, and so on. So it's very important to have access to that pool of expertise. They can also contribute directly to investment, invest in supply chain projects, invest in specific projects, invest even in companies, working in the landscape. And they can obviously provide market access, so long-term offtake opportunities. And very often when you work with landscape stakeholders, one of the key prerequisites is that by working with them, by them investing into improved standards and practices, it will open up new commercial opportunities for them. And private sector can provide this kind of long-term purchase agreements or sustainability premiums and so on. Importantly, as well within the multi-stakeholder platform is that large corporations, because of the way they have in specific value chains, they can have a lot of influence on land managers and producers to make sure they comply with best practice and higher sustainability standards. Okay, so I think this is just a summary of what we've just discussed, that there are a lot of upside working with the private sector. On the other hand, we need to remain aware that accountability is the key, and that multi-stakeholder platform should not be limited to multi-stakeholder dialogue, but it should be really based on the foundation of a clear action plan and monitoring framework to make sure that that does not turn into greenwashing, but that there is a strong commitment and a strong accountability framework towards actual impact and benefit on social and environmental indicators.
Hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining. My name is Akshay Regmi. I am the Business Engagement Manager for Climate Catalyst. Climate Catalyst is an NGO that works with international and national coalitions to secure decisive action by governments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We connect with civil society organizations, businesses and investors, and new champions for climate action. We're currently working on a climate action campaign to protect and restore European peatlands. For our peatlands work, we conduct advocacy at the EU level. We work at the national level in Germany to raise ambitions for implementing strong peatlands protection policies. And we work to build power among diverse organizations that are working for peatlands restoration. Last but not least, we aim to engage with the private sector, with businesses, business associations, investors and investor groups to become champions for peatlands and take meaningful actions for peatlands restoration. So briefly, why peatlands? Peatlands are really the unsung heroes of carbon capture. They cover 3% of the world's surface, but hold 30% of the world's carbon. So they're vital ecosystems in the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss. Peatlands provide a wide range of ecosystem services for society and economy, the major ones being water filtration, flood mitigation, drought mitigation, and wildfire. These ecosystem services are very relevant for businesses such as water utilities, for food and beverage companies, for insurance companies, and others. And as Florian mentioned, as extreme weather events grow more and more common, these ecosystem services will be more and more relevant, not just for society, but for the private sector as well. Next slide. Healthy peatlands are overall absorbers of carbon from the atmosphere. However, degradation is shifting the balance of peatlands' ability to absorb carbon. So as a result of degradation, 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions each year come from degraded peatlands. So preventing annual peatland loss and damage will be critical to achieving global climate goals. Peatlands can be restored through a process of rewetting, which is introducing vegetation and sphagnum mosses that cover the exposed peat areas. However, next slide, the cost of peatlands restoration is high. The capital outlays are associated with rewetting, replanting, sphagnum plugging. The actual restoration cost accounts for about 85% of total costs. Meanwhile, the rest is from management costs, from site surveys, various fees, planning, maintenance, and so on. Peatlands restoration is capital intensive. So far, public finance has been the main kind of source of capital to restore peatlands, but public finance alone cannot do it. So, for example, in the UK, the Natural Environment Impact Fund of the UK government has promised £10 million to restore 35,000 hectares of wetland. However, that's only 1% of all the modified and actively degraded peatlands in the country. So there is a clear need to unlock private finance for peatlands restoration. There is a need for, but of course, unlocking private finance for peatlands has its challenges. The first and foremost is revenue generation from peatlands restoration. As Florian's presentation mentioned, businesses are interested in the bottom line, in profit. So to make a clear business case of revenue generation from peatlands restoration is a challenge. Also, revenue predictability. It's not about just having, it's about having consistent revenue over the course of restoration. A peatlands restoration project can take anywhere from 15 to 20 years. How do we ensure predictability of that revenue? And of course, this is very high level, and there are variations within geographies, within economies, and so on. So there is a need for more revenue-generating, self-sustaining financing mechanisms, which provide lucrative opportunity for private capital providers to participate in the peatlands restoration business. Public finance can play a role by establishing institutions and mechanisms to attract private capital. But indeed, the challenges are that the supply and demand of peatlands restoration projects is also not there. There aren't restoration-ready projects that would be attractive to private finance at the moment. There isn't a market, so to speak, of peatlands restoration projects. Concurrent to that, there isn't a developed professional expertise around peatlands restoration, something that can be deployed relatively easy, even if capital was secured. The main kind of owners of degraded peatlands, which tends to be farmers in Europe and across the world, they do not necessarily speak the language of finance. So there is a need for investors and investor groups to become the bridge between the holders of the land and the holders of the capital. These are some of the challenges that that are apparent in unlocking private finance for peatlands restoration. But indeed, peatlands restoration holds a lot of benefits for the private sector. Financial returns. Peatlands restoration can provide revenue from polludiculture products, which are polludiculture is essentially the use of material that grows on rewetted peatlands. And there is, of course, the trade of carbon credits is another revenue source that can be of benefit to the private sector. Outside of financial returns, there are also kind of reputational benefits that a business can gain from engaging in peatlands restoration work, such as becoming a climate, nature, or biodiversity champion, a message that is extremely resonant and increasingly resonant with businesses, with the customers of a business. For specific industries, like I mentioned before, food and beverage industries, water utilities, the benefits to water quality from peatlands restoration is of immense value, and something that can be leveraged in conversations with these businesses to spark their interest in peatlands restoration. Another one is future regulation compliance. There are a lot of regulations that are coming in, especially in Europe, around the protection and restoration of peatlands. So businesses that are ahead of the curve in regulation compliance will have an edge over their competitors. The COP15 Global Biodiversity Framework has set out targets. Countries will now create their policy frameworks to implement those targets, and those are going to have effects for the private sector. So the private sector actors that are more active in peatlands restoration will be ahead of the curve, which is also a benefit for the private sector. And indeed, there's also a first mover advantage by innovative products, which we can move on to the next slide. So one of the avenues of revenue from peatlands restoration is from polludiculture, which is wet farming, agriculture use of wet and rewetted peatlands. Indeed, polludiculture is one of the promising avenues that needs more investment from the private sector to really unlock the revenue generating potential of rewetted peatlands. Some businesses in Germany, for example, are conducting pilot programs to use the reed material that grows on restored peatlands to make packaging products, replacing wasteful plastic packaging. So businesses can take on the challenge of figuring out new business models using products from rewetted peatlands. The other avenue, of course, is carbon credits or biodiversity credits that may provide revenue generation for businesses. Businesses can, in addition to trading in credits, they can also engage in nature-based solutions work and actually provide the capital upfront to restore peatlands while also trading in carbon credits. Finally, there's also payment for ecosystem services. For example, a water utility company paying a landowner to restore peatlands and benefiting from the restoration of peatlands in terms of water quality, which is also another avenue. So this has been a kind of a very high-level introduction to the issues that are involved in restoration and unlocking capital for a very specific landscape or ecosystem, which is peatlands. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Akshay. We've had a few questions coming in on the chat while you've been speaking. I'd actually like to bring both Florian as well back for a couple of clarifying questions that have come up in the chat feed. But while I get Florian on, there's a few coming up that are quite directed to you, Akshay. So one specifically from Bhuvan around whether Climate Catalyst is partnering with any EU research institutes to develop polludiculture solutions to provide sustainable options for the private sector.
Indeed, yeah, we are in, if I may, we are in conversation with some of the some organizations, such as the Tomorrow initiative in Germany, which is actually looking at how large corporations who send out a lot of packages, for example, can change their operations to create packaging material from polludiculture products. So indeed, this is not, this is a very, it's an attempt to create a market that does not exist yet. It needs a lot of innovation, a lot of thinking, a lot of kind of business risk. So we are supporting and in partnership with organizations that are looking at how to bring polludiculture to the mainstream, how to really create a robust market, a large market for polludiculture products. And I would be happy to share more with you if you get in touch with us.
Great, thank you. And there was also a question around whether it's possible to estimate an average cost to restore peatlands per hectare. I feel like that might be a favorite question for a lot of people.
Unfortunately, I do not have an answer. The cost of restoration indeed is extremely variable by location, geography, and so on. I did mention that. I think I mentioned what was it? The 30 million, the 10 million to restore 30 million hectares. So maybe there's an average there. But indeed, it is a capital intensive process, and there is a need for patient capital. It's not just an upfront cost, but an ongoing cost, and restoring an ecosystem indeed takes a long time. So there is a need for reasonable patient capital that public finance can maybe trigger, but private capital is definitely needed for this important ecosystem.
Great, thanks. I might bring Florian. I know that you're having trouble switching your video on, but maybe I'll direct one to you around how big a role can tourism play in revenue generation when it comes to restoration. Would you be able to talk to that? If you can hear my question.
Yes, thank you, Disha. Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me correctly. I'm having some issues with connection, but that's a very interesting question. It's actually a project that the lab is trying to develop in Southeast Asia. So trying to work on what we've coined regenerative tourism, which is basically to integrate low impact ecotourism development within a more comprehensive destination management strategy. So that try to basically concentrate value creation in high-end tourism while redirecting some of the revenues towards conservation and restoration of coral reefs, forests, and so on. So it's very interesting because you can see the logic in trying to protect the natural asset that will bring more tourists into the destination. And yes, ecotourism has a very important role to play in certain landscapes. That being said, I mean, one of the issues that tends to arise is that a lot of community groups, social forestry projects will come up with business plan around ecotourism. And I mean, these are large investments that may be not necessarily suited to the scale of a community project, and that would require, again, a landscape approach to involve, private developers, local government, and so on. So it's indeed a lot of potential. In practice, it requires an investment and a scale of investment that is not necessarily in the reach of community-based organizations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Florian. And others also feel free, if you also have answers to some of these questions, to add some of your responses and examples in the chat feed. And as we move on, we'd love to bring Andika onto the call.
Sure. Thank you, Disha. Would it be possible for me to share my screen?
Yes.
Let me share it now and let me know if you can see it.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right. So I think I was told to explain a bit about Rimba and cover some of the points that might be interesting for this group. Just a little bit about Rimba Collective itself. So Rimba Collective is a long-term financing for forest conservation and restoration in Southeast Asia. And we have a portfolio goal of delivering 500,000 hectares of conservation and restoration financing in the next 30 years. And so this is designed to be a long-term financing mechanism. If you see this big number here, when we extrapolate, the need to fund conservation and restoration for as much as 500,000 hectares for the next 30 years, that would add up to around $1 billion. to fund the whole portfolio for that 30 years. And the intention is for us to also be able to improve the livelihoods of 32,000 people in Southeast Asia that lives within and around the forest that we intervene. And this ambition is actually started by a group of companies who are exposed to palm oil supply chain. And so at the very beginning, Rimba Collective as an idea started in early 2020 when the first pandemic happened. But some of the biggest FMCG company started to talk about how can they go beyond their current sustainability commitment, because I think their current sustainability commitment is focusing around no deforestation, no degradations, but it is not so much of a nature positive agenda. And so Rimba Collective was first conceived as an idea to think about how can the business integrate conservation and restoration financing into their sustainability commitment. And then it needs to be something that is credible, verifiable, and scalable, but also long-lasting. And so the idea of using a performance-based mechanism that is combined with supply chain metrics is something that is the very beginning of Rimba Collective, and thus born the concept of Rimba Collective, where we basically come up with a financing mechanism that involves a contribution model from companies who are keen to join the Rimba Collective. As you can see on the diagram here, our existing clients includes Unilever, PepsiCo, Nestle, and P&G. All four of them have a big exposure to palm oil supply chain. And one of the unique thing about Rimba is that the contribution model for each of the companies are related with their procurements of palm oil volume within their supply chain. And so the more they use palm oil within their supply chain, the more they have to put funds into the Rimba Collective financing platform. And using this contribution model, each of the company would have a fair share of their contributions to Rimba Collective Finance Platform, and they put the fund into this Rimba Collective Finance Platform. This is actually a separate entity from the Strike Capital. This is a SPV, or a special purpose vehicle company, which has sole mandate to deliver financing for forest conservation and restorations across Southeast Asia. And so the idea is that Lestar Capital, which is the manager of Rimba Collective, would curate and identify credible projects across Southeast Asia, and we will sign a contract with the project to deliver conservations and restoration outcomes in the next 25 years. And again, one of the key metrics that we use here, this is not a carbon-based metrics. This is not something that delivers using a metric such as CO2 emission, but it is focusing on the metrics of hectares of conservation and hectares of restoration that is delivered by the projects. We do have a bundle of other ecosystem services outcomes as part of that hectares of conservation and hectares of restoration deliverables. That includes livelihood outcomes, climate outcomes, as well as biodiversity outcomes, but it is not used as the main currency for this program. What is unique about Rimba, another thing, is that we are approaching this mechanism using a portfolio approach, and so it enables us to de-risk the projects that are within the portfolio. It also enables us to do scalable portfolio. If we want to add more to the portfolio, we can do that through adding more projects. But it also adds our ability to onboard multiple typology of projects, not just one type of project. And so we are looking into investing on social forestry projects in Southeast Asia. We can also support high impact forest conservations, but also restorations of peatland, restorations of degraded forests across Southeast Asia. And so this approach using portfolio management is becoming one of the key features of Rimba, and enable us to provide a wider range of ecosystem services outcomes to the users of Rimba. And of course, given that this is a result-based payment mechanism, the result should be quantifiable and credible. And so at the end of the day, each of the projects within the Rimba Collective portfolio will need to be certified by a certification body such as CCB or PlanFIFO or FERA. It really depends on what kind of aspect that each of the project focuses on. So, for example, for a project that has high biodiversity scores, we might go for a CCB certifications. For a project that is focusing more on the climate outcomes, we might go for FERA. But at the end of the day, the result needs to be verified, and that would go back to the Rimba Collective Ecosystem Services Registry. And then the result of the ecosystem services outcome will then be distributed to the users of Rimba based on the proportions of their contributions to Rimba Collective. So that essentially is what the platform is. And as of this year, we managed to onboard around 73,000 hectares of conservations and restoration projects within our portfolio. It's essentially, we have 6 active projects now that we have contracted out with Rimba Collective. And the target will keep increasing until the year 6 of our operations, where the plan is to hit that 500,000 hectares number for the whole total targets of Rimba Collective portfolio. For this year, we have a target of achieving around 200,000 hectares of contracted projects within our portfolio. We have about 2 times that within our pipeline, but given the survival rate of the onboarding stage, this is a pretty reasonable number for the type of initiative that Rimba is doing. So I think I'll stop there to give us a little bit more time to discuss this. I'll give the floor back to you, Disha.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andika. We did have a couple of questions come in while you were speaking. One, well, maybe I'll bunch a couple together. So we've got one from John, who is asking whether you'll be looking at Africa as well, or if there are similar collectives maybe that are also focusing on this region. And then also about how you've developed the performance-based mechanism. I know you've just spoken a little bit about that. Maybe if you can talk about how this was accepted by the companies as well.
Sure. Maybe the first questions first. So Rimba Collective for now is focusing only in Southeast Asia, and this is given the focus of the Rimba Collective contribution model is linked heavily to the palm oil volume that is procured by these 4 users of Rimba, and a lot of their sourcing region is based in Southeast Asia, and so that's why we're focusing only in Southeast Asia right now. But there is indeed an interest to bring Rimba Collective to other regions as well as other commodities as well. So we might be seeing, some kind of a rubber collective or other type of commodity collectives in the near future that kind of mimicking the models of Rimba Collective, but it is still in a very early development stage at this point. In terms of building a performance-based mechanism that is accepted by the companies, this is, I think, would be very much a case-by-case. It depends on the users of the mechanism itself. Fortunately for us, the 4 CGM has a very wide range of ecosystem and sustainability commitment. Some of them have explicit targets of doing conservations and restorations of X numbers of hectares of forest, and so the performance-based mechanism can be based on that indicator alone. But I think as we go through other tiers of companies, for example, if we're talking about processor and traders of palm oil, they might have a much more narrower focus in terms of their sustainability commitment. So a metric such as just a number of hectares of conservation and restoration might not be the best selling point for that kind of companies. In fact, we've been seeing that a lot of the companies in the downstream part of the industry, the upstream part of the industry, which is closer to the ground, they care more about climate outcomes, such as how can they be benefited from a scope 3 emission reductions if they want to set an SBTi commitment. And so the more upstream a company is, I think the narrow their focus of spatial scope is, and the more downstream a company is, they might have a wider range of commitment and spatial scope to begin with.
Great, thank you. And then Bhuvan, I know that you can. Is it okay if I just kind of paraphrase you a little bit by asking whether you think that from engaging in a collective like this, that the companies are starting to think about their overall impact more broadly beyond compensating, I guess, for some of their negative impacts? Do you feel like that's something of a conversation that is potentially happening with the collective?
Yeah, I think there's an emerging sorry,
Daniel, let me just mute you for a sec. Hey, sorry, back to you.
No, yeah, I think there's an emerging focus more on nature and a nature-based commitment as we are looking into the SBTi that is, more climate focused. There's now an emerging interest on SBT or science-based targets for natures. We have the TNFD, which is a financial disclosure for nature-based risk or nature-related risk. So I think in the future, a lot of this, private sector companies would go beyond a no deforestation or no degradations of ecosystem type of commitment, but go into a nature positive agenda. And so I think it might not be directly linked to their footprint or liabilities in the past, but it is more of a forward-looking sustainability commitment rather than just a protection of their sourcing region.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I think Florian also has answer on that part.
Yeah, Florian, did you want to come in?
Yeah.
You're welcome to.
Yeah, no, just to say that there are different mechanisms linked to the palm oil supply chain. So under the RSPO, which is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, there is a mechanism called RACP, which stands for Remediation and Compensation Mechanism, which basically looks at past deforestation and looks at basically offsetting those responsibilities, those liabilities, by funding conservation in adjacent areas. So that's looking at past, past deforestation and liabilities. I believe the target that has been set by the founders of Rimba Collective is additional to the liability and compensation target. So it's more of a natural positive approach than a compensation of past deforestation, if I'm not mistaken.
Great, thank you. And sorry, I just see that we might have a room for a couple more questions. Sam, I might just bring yours up around whether you've considered modern biodiversity monitoring techniques that can enable large-scale biodiversity monitoring, such as environmental DNA, bioacoustics, to enable you to collect that kind of data. Is that something that you're looking at, Andika?
Yeah, definitely. I think given the increasing interest on biodiversity type credit, we are also working with several partners to look into methodology that is acceptable by the scientific community, but also can be linked to the market that enables us to produce this kind of a measurable impact on biodiversity. One of the key metrics that we're looking into is the STAR framework, the species threat abatement risk methodology. But one of the key challenges of doing this kind of biodiversity metrics is that the first thing is setting up a baseline for biodiversity is much more harder, and there's no remote sensing based proxy that enables us to get granular data at a large scale, a large spatial scale. And so kicking off a biodiversity focused project is going to be much more expensive than just an area based conservation. But I think a lot of this methodology that is currently being developed by some of these organizations, including STAR framework, we're keen to piloting that in our project area as well to better understand, you know, what would it take for us to improve the biodiversity baseline as well as measuring the conservation impact towards the advancements of the biodiversity metrics in our project area.
Great, thank you. And Sam, feel free to post in the chat if you've got any follow-ups, but we also have the opportunity to continue these conversations in the D groups, and we'll share a link in the chat feed and have throughout the session. But before we close the call, Andika, one last question around how replicable do you think this model is, or this collective model is? Sabrina was asking around whether it's something that can be set up with a small number of FMCGs or a larger number of smaller businesses contributing. Is that something that people are approaching you about?
Yeah, I think we're also still learning about how replicable this model is. We certainly wanted to expand the user base of Rimba and adding more, other tiers of companies. As you know, the current users of Rimba are all FMCGs and big FMCGs. But as we talk with more a company with different tiers, I think they have a much more different use cases for a product like Rimba Collective. And so I think the replicability of this kind of model really depends on whether you can find a silver lining of use cases for the company in that tier that you want to address. For example, maybe a use cases for a conservation, hectare-based conservation and restoration is going to be a much more narrow in terms of the spatial focus for a processor and traders, or even for growers of palm oil. You might find it different as well with rubber companies. They might have different characteristics within their supply chain that makes it us not being able to replicate in full what Rimba Collective has right now to a rubber collective, for example. So I think it really depends on finding that silver lining between these different companies in the same tier. What would be their best use cases of this kind of hectare-based conservation and restoration program?
I want to bring the session to a close, and I really want to thank you all for joining today. We'll share the slides and the recording of the presentations following the call. We do have a number of other sessions also over this next few weeks. So we've